The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lincoln Heights as 9-year-old Walter Collins kissed his mother goodbye on March 10, 1928. It was a Saturday like any other in Los Angeles, warm, promising, filled with the kind of endless possibility that drew millions to California's golden shores. Walter clutched his dime tightly in his small palm, enough for a movie ticket and maybe some candy at the Majestic Theater downtown. His mother, Christine Collins, watched from their modest home as her son's small figure disappeared around the corner, his brown hair catching the light one last time. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary moment, a mother sending her child to the movies, would become the beginning of one of America's most shocking criminal cases, a nightmare that would expose the dark underbelly of the City of Angels and test the limits of a mother's love. Walter never made it to the theater that day. When evening fell and he failed to return home, Christine's maternal instinct transformed from mild concern to paralyzing fear. She walked the familiar route to the Majestic, calling his name, asking shopkeepers and passers-by if they'd seen a small boy with brown hair and bright eyes. No one had. The busy streets of Los Angeles had simply swallowed her son whole. By midnight, Christine Collins was standing in the stark fluorescent lighting of the Lincoln Heights police station, her hands trembling as she provided Walter's description to a bored desk sergeant. 5 feet tall, 70 pounds, brown hair, hazel eyes, wearing a blue sailor suit. Details that meant everything to a mother and nothing to a city that saw dozens of missing children reports every month. The officer's mechanical note-taking and casual demeanor suggested this was routine business in a city where people disappeared as often as they arrived seeking Hollywood dreams. "Boys run away all the time, ma'am," the sergeant told her with practiced indifference. "He'll probably turn up in a day or two, hungry and ready to come home." But Christine Collins knew her son. Walter wasn't the type to run away. He was responsible, obedient, a child who helped his mother with household chores and never strayed far from home without permission. Something terrible had happened. She could feel it in her bones with the certainty that only a mother possesses. The first week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and frantic searching. Christine took time off from her job at the telephone company, spending her days walking the streets of Los Angeles, showing Walter's photograph to anyone who would look. She contacted other police stations, placed advertisements in newspapers, and reached out to child welfare organizations. The response was always the same: polite concern followed by the suggestion that she wait a little longer. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. As days turned into weeks, Christine's desperation grew. She haunted the halls of City Hall, demanding meetings with anyone who would listen. The Los Angeles Police Department, already overwhelmed and understaffed, treated her like a nuisance rather than a grieving mother. Detective Captain J.J. Jones, the man who would become central to this unfolding nightmare, dismissed her concerns with the casual cruelty of someone who had seen too many broken families. "Mrs. Collins," he told her during one of their brief encounters, "you need to accept that your boy might not be coming home. These things happen in a city this size." But acceptance was not in Christine Collins' vocabulary. She organized search parties with neighbors, posted flyers throughout the city, and kept a vigil that would continue for months. Her small apartment became a command center for a one-woman investigation that the police seemed unwilling to conduct. What Christine didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that Walter's disappearance was connected to something far more sinister than a simple runaway case. Miles away, in the agricultural community of Wineville, dark secrets were already taking root. A network of predators was operating with impunity, and Walter Collins had become their latest victim in a scheme so horrific it would eventually shock the entire nation. The ticking clock of justice had begun, though no one realized it yet. In the coming months, Christine Collins would discover that sometimes a mother's love is the only force strong enough to expose the monsters hiding in plain sight. The Los Angeles of 1928 glittered with the intoxicating promise of the American dream, but beneath its sun-soaked veneer festered a corruption so deep it reached into every corner of civic life. As Christine Collins desperately searched for her missing son, she was unknowingly battling against a system designed to protect itself rather than serve justice. The city had exploded in size during the 1920s boom, swelling from 500,000 residents to over 1 million in less than a decade. Oil derricks pumped black gold from beneath suburban lawns, while Hollywood's silver screen projected fantasies that drew dreamers from across the nation. But this rapid growth had created a perfect storm of opportunity for those willing to exploit the chaos. The Los Angeles Police Department, overwhelmed and understaffed, had become a playground for ambitious men who saw badges as licenses for personal gain rather than public service. Captain J.J. Jones epitomized this culture of corruption. A heavy-set man with cold eyes and a politician's smile, Jones had built his reputation on solving high-profile cases quickly. Too quickly, critics whispered. His methods prioritized closing cases over finding truth, an approach that made him popular with city officials who valued statistics over justice. When wealthy donors complained about crime, Jones delivered arrests. When newspapers demanded action, he provided dramatic press conferences. What he rarely provided was actual competent police work. Christine Collins represented everything Jones despised about his job, a persistent civilian who refused to accept convenient explanations. As weeks passed without progress on Walter's case, she became increasingly vocal in her criticism of the department's lackadaisical investigation. She appeared at city council meetings, wrote letters to newspapers, and organized other parents whose children had also vanished without adequate police response. "The police aren't even looking for these children," Christine told a gathering of concerned parents at a Lincoln Heights church in April 1928. "They file reports and forget about them, as if our children don't matter because we're not wealthy enough to demand attention." Her words struck a nerve in a community that had long felt ignored by city officials. Other parents began sharing stories of missing children dismissed as runaways, of investigations that lasted only days before being quietly shelved. A pattern emerged. A disturbing number of children, mostly from working-class families, had disappeared over the past several years with minimal police follow-up. The department's standard response to missing children cases revealed a callous disregard for vulnerable families. Poor children were assumed to be runaways seeking adventure or escaping difficult home situations. Middle-class children received slightly more attention but were often categorized as problem children, acting out against parental authority. Only the disappearances of wealthy children prompted serious investigations, complete with detective assignments and media attention. This disparity wasn't accidental. It reflected the LAPD's priorities during an era when the department served as much as a private security force for the city's elite as a public service organization. Wealthy neighborhoods received regular patrols and rapid response times, while working-class areas like Lincoln Heights were left to fend for themselves. Officers supplemented their modest salaries through donations from grateful business owners and property developers who appreciated special attention. Mayor George Cryer's administration actively encouraged this system, viewing the police as partners in promoting the city's image rather than as independent law enforcement. Negative publicity about crime or corruption threatened the continued flow of investment capital that funded the city's explosive growth. When inconvenient truths emerged, they were quickly buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and misdirection. Christine's growing activism made her a target for this institutional hostility. Detective sergeants began treating her visits to the station with obvious annoyance, rolling their eyes when she appeared with new information or requests for updates. Her phone calls went unreturned. Her letters to city officials received form responses that acknowledged her concern while promising nothing concrete. The local press, dependent on maintaining good relationships with police sources for crime stories, largely ignored Christine's campaign. The few journalists who showed initial interest were quickly discouraged by editors who preferred not to antagonize law enforcement. Stories about missing children didn't sell newspapers unless they involved wealthy families or dramatic circumstances that could be sensationalized. But Christine Collins possessed a stubborn determination forged by years of raising a child alone while working full-time to support them both. She had learned to navigate bureaucracy through her job at the telephone company, where attention to detail and persistence were essential skills. These same qualities now served her as she documented every interaction with police, kept detailed records of her own investigative efforts, and built a network of other affected families. What she couldn't have known was that her son's disappearance was connected to a criminal enterprise operating far beyond the reach of Los Angeles corruption. In the agricultural community of Wineville, nearly 40 miles southeast of the city, a different kind of evil was taking root, one that would eventually expose the LAPD's incompetence in ways that even Captain Jones couldn't cover up. On May 15, 1928, exactly 5 months after Walter Collins vanished, Christine received the phone call she had prayed for every night since her son's disappearance. Detective Captain J.J. Jones himself was on the line, his voice unusually upbeat as he delivered what he claimed was miraculous news. "Mrs. Collins, I have wonderful news for you. We found your boy. Walter is safe and sound, and you can pick him up at the station this afternoon." Christine's knees nearly buckled with relief. After months of sleepless nights and endless searching, her prayers had finally been answered. She rushed to the Lincoln Heights police station, her heart pounding with anticipation at seeing her son's face again. But when Detective Jones led her into the station's waiting area, the boy sitting on a wooden bench was not Walter Collins. The child before her was approximately the right age, with similar brown hair and a small frame, but Christine knew instantly that this was not her son. The boy's face was rounder, his ears positioned differently, his eyes a different shade entirely. Most tellingly, he was circumcised. Walter was not. When she hugged him, nothing felt familiar. No mother's instinct recognized this child as her own. "This is not my son," Christine said quietly, stepping back from the confused-looking boy. Captain Jones' expression hardened immediately. "Mrs. Collins, you've been under tremendous strain. It's natural that Walter might look different after being away for so long. Children change quickly at that age." "I know my own child," Christine replied, her voice growing stronger despite her shock. "This boy is not Walter Collins." The room fell silent except for the shuffle of police officers trying to avoid eye contact. Jones had orchestrated this reunion as a public relations victory, complete with newspaper photographers waiting outside to document the heartwarming story of a mother reunited with her missing son. The last thing he needed was the actual mother refusing to cooperate with his carefully staged narrative. "Look at him closely," Jones insisted, his tone becoming increasingly aggressive. "He's been through an ordeal. He's traumatized and probably doesn't remember much. But this is your boy, and you need to take him home." The child himself remained silent throughout this exchange, watching the adults argue over his identity with the hollow expression of someone who had witnessed things no child should see. When Christine knelt down to speak with him directly, asking gentle questions about their home and family memories, his responses were vague and coached sounding. "Where did you find him?" Christine asked, turning back to Jones. "That's police business. The important thing is that he's safe now and ready to go home with his mother." But Christine Collins had spent 5 months investigating her son's disappearance, and she had developed an instinct for when people were lying to her. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The boy's appearance, the lack of details about where he'd been found, Jones' unusual personal involvement in what should have been routine paperwork. Word of the reunion had already leaked to the press, and reporters were gathering outside the station. Jones was trapped between his promise of a happy ending and a mother who refused to accept his version of events. His solution revealed the depths of corruption and incompetence that characterized the LAPD under his leadership. "Mrs. Collins, you're clearly not thinking straight," he announced loud enough for nearby officers to hear. "This kind of emotional instability isn't healthy for the child. Perhaps you need some time to adjust before taking custody." The implication was clear. If Christine didn't play along with his charade, she would be painted as an unfit mother suffering from some sort of breakdown. In 1928, a woman's credibility was easily dismissed, especially when she challenged male authority figures in positions of power. Christine realized she was facing an impossible choice. She could accept this stranger as her son and participate in Jones' cover-up, or she could continue insisting on the truth and risk losing any chance of finding the real Walter. The system that should have protected her child was now using another missing boy as a prop in their bureaucratic theater. "I will not take this child home and pretend he is my son," Christine said firmly. "Walter Collins is still missing, and this department needs to find him instead of trying to convince me that one lost boy is the same as another." Jones' face flushed red with anger. No civilian, especially not a working-class woman, had ever challenged him so directly in front of his subordinates. The reporters outside were getting restless, and the longer this standoff continued, the more likely it was that his carefully crafted story would fall apart. What happened next would expose the true nature of police power in 1928 Los Angeles, when a mother's love collided with institutional corruption. Christine Collins was about to discover that in a system built on lies, telling the truth could be treated as a crime. 3 days after refusing to accept the wrong child as her son, Christine Collins was awakened at dawn by heavy knocking on her door. 2 uniformed officers stood on her porch with an official document that would forever change her understanding of justice in America. The paper, signed by Captain J.J. Jones and approved by a compliant judge, declared Christine Collins mentally unstable and ordered her immediate commitment to the psychopathic ward at Los Angeles General Hospital. "You're coming with us, ma'am," the senior officer said with practiced indifference. Doctor's orders. Christine's crime was simple. She had embarrassed the Los Angeles Police Department by publicly insisting that they had returned the wrong child to her. In 1928, when women possessed limited legal rights and police authority was rarely questioned, such defiance could be easily reframed as mental illness. The commitment papers described Christine as suffering from delusional thinking and refusal to accept reality, psychiatric terms that perfectly masked the political motivations behind her incarceration. The psychopathic ward at Los Angeles General Hospital was a gray, institutional nightmare designed more for punishment than healing. Christine found herself among genuinely mentally ill patients, as well as other women whose primary diagnosis seemed to be inconvenience to powerful men. Her fellow inmates included wives who had challenged their husbands' business dealings, daughters who had refused arranged marriages, and mothers who had asked too many questions about their missing children. Dr. George Tarr, the psychiatrist assigned to Christine's case, had built his career on accommodating the needs of city officials who required troublesome individuals to disappear quietly. His medical evaluations invariably supported whatever outcome his powerful clients desired. When Jones requested that Christine be diagnosed with paranoid delusion disorder, Tarr obliged without conducting more than a cursory examination. "Mrs. Collins, you're here because you're suffering from a severe break with reality," Dr. Tarr explained during their first session. "Your inability to recognize your own son indicates serious psychological trauma that requires extended treatment." Christine's protests were carefully noted in her medical file as further evidence of her disturbed mental state. Every rational argument she made was twisted into proof of her delusion. When she provided specific details about Walter's physical characteristics that differed from the returned boy, Tarr wrote that she was fixated on minor details as a way of avoiding acceptance of traumatic reality. When she questioned the hospital's authority to hold her without proper legal proceedings, he documented her paranoid suspicions about institutional authority. The treatment was designed to break her spirit through isolation and degradation. Christine was forced to take powerful sedatives that left her groggy and disoriented. She was denied visitors, including family members who might have supported her version of events. Her mail was intercepted and destroyed before reaching intended recipients. The hospital staff treated her with the casual cruelty reserved for patients who had no advocates on the outside. Meanwhile, Captain Jones was spinning Christine's commitment as evidence of his department's compassion and wisdom. At press conferences, he portrayed himself as a caring public servant who had recognized a mother's psychological breakdown and arranged for appropriate medical intervention. The same newspapers that had initially showed interest in Walter's disappearance now ran stories about the disturbed woman who had refused to accept her returned son. "It's a tragic case," Jones told reporters with practiced sympathy. "The trauma of her child's disappearance has clearly affected this poor woman's ability to think rationally. We're just grateful that we were able to get her the help she needs before she could harm herself or the boy." The returned child, whose real name was Arthur Hutchins Jr., was placed in temporary foster care while authorities decided his fate. Arthur had his own tragic story. He had been abandoned by his father and was living on the streets when he was picked up by police in Illinois and somehow convinced or coerced into claiming to be Walter Collins. The boy was as much a victim of the system's failures as Christine and Walter, but his plight received no attention from officials who were focused on maintaining their fabricated narrative. From her hospital bed, Christine could only watch helplessly as the search for her real son was abandoned entirely. The case files were marked closed. The investigation officially concluded with Walter's safe return. Any leads or tips about missing children that might have pointed toward the real perpetrators were now ignored, filed away as irrelevant to a case that had been solved through bureaucratic fiat rather than actual police work. But even powerful institutions make mistakes when they become overconfident in their ability to control information. While Christine Collins was silenced behind hospital walls, events were unfolding in a small agricultural community 40 miles away that would eventually expose every lie that Jones and his department had constructed. The truth about Walter Collins and dozens of other missing children was about to emerge from the most unexpected source, a place where the LAPD's corruption couldn't reach and their cover-ups couldn't hold. In the dusty agricultural community of Wineville, California, 40 miles southeast of Los Angeles, something sinister had taken root beneath the seemingly peaceful veneer of orange groves and chicken farms. While Christine Collins languished in a psychiatric ward for the crime of knowing her own child, the residents of this small farming town were beginning to whisper about the strange happenings at the Northcott Ranch. The Northcott property sat isolated on 20 acres of scrubland, bordered by citrus orchards and accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through the countryside. To passing motorists, it appeared to be just another struggling farm, a collection of weathered buildings, chicken coops, and a modest house where Gordon Stewart Northcott lived with his mother, Louise, and his young nephew, Sanford Clark. But the neighbors had begun to notice disturbing patterns that didn't match the property's agricultural facade. Strange cars would arrive at the ranch late at night, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they navigated the winding dirt road. Sometimes, these vehicles would leave before dawn with fewer passengers than they had arrived with. The sounds that drifted from the property after dark were equally troubling. Children's voices crying out, followed by abrupt silence that seemed to swallow the rural night. Gordon Northcott himself was a figure that made people uncomfortable without being able to articulate exactly why. A tall, gaunt man in his 20s with hollow eyes and an unsettling smile, he claimed to be running a legitimate chicken ranch, but his flock was suspiciously small for such a large operation. When questioned by neighbors about his business, Northcott would become evasive, changing the subject or making excuses to end conversations quickly. More disturbing were the children who were occasionally seen around the property, young boys who appeared malnourished and frightened, dressed in ill-fitting clothes and supervised with an intensity that seemed more like imprisonment than care. These children would appear for days or weeks before vanishing entirely, leading neighbors to assume they were temporary farm workers or relatives visiting from out of state. Mrs. Alma Garner, whose property bordered the Northcott Ranch, had been particularly troubled by what she witnessed during her evening walks. She had seen children working in the fields under brutal conditions, laboring from dawn until well past dark without adequate rest or food. When she attempted to approach the fence line to get a better look, Northcott would appear almost instantly, warning her that she was trespassing and needed to move along. There was something in his eyes that made me afraid, Mrs. Garner would later tell investigators. He looked at those children like they weren't human beings, like they were just property he owned. The local postmaster had also noticed irregularities in the Northcott Ranch's mail delivery. The family received an unusual number of packages from Los Angeles and other distant cities, many addressed to names that didn't match the known residents. Some packages appeared to contain children's clothing and toys, leading the postmaster to wonder if the Northcotts were running some sort of unlicensed boarding house or children's home. But perhaps the most telling observation came from Dr. Homer Dahan, a traveling veterinarian who had been called to the ranch to treat sick chickens. During his visit, he noticed several freshly dug areas in the orange grove behind the main house. When he asked Northcott about the excavation, he was told they were preparing to plant new trees, but no saplings were ever planted, and the disturbed earth remained visible for weeks afterward. Sanford Clark, Northcott's 20-year-old nephew who lived on the property, had become increasingly withdrawn and nervous in his interactions with townspeople. When he ventured into Wineville for supplies, residents noticed bruises on his arms and face, along with a fearful demeanor that suggested he was living under constant threat. Store clerks who attempted friendly conversation found him reluctant to speak and quick to glance toward the door, as if expecting someone to be watching him. The pieces of this disturbing puzzle might have remained scattered indefinitely, dismissed as small-town gossip and rural paranoia, if not for a single moment of desperate courage that would crack open the entire conspiracy. On August 31st, 1928, Sanford Clark made a decision that would finally expose the horrors hidden at the Northcott Ranch and vindicate a mother's determination to find the truth about her missing son. The truth about Walter Collins and dozens of other missing children was about to emerge from the most unexpected source, carried by a young man who could no longer bear the weight of the secrets he had been forced to keep. On the morning of August 31st, 1928, Sanford Clark stumbled into the office of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, his clothes torn and his face bearing fresh bruises that told a story of desperate escape. The 20-year-old had walked nearly 15 miles through the night, driven by terror and a conscience that could no longer bear the weight of the horrors he had witnessed at his uncle's ranch. Sheriff's Deputy Cecil Kuhn looked up from his paperwork to find a young man who appeared to be on the verge of complete collapse. Clark's hands trembled uncontrollably as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper as he began to reveal secrets that would shock the nation and expose one of the most heinous criminal enterprises in American history. "My uncle, Gordon Northcott," Clark began, struggling to form coherent sentences through his fear. "He's been killing children. So many children. I can't stay quiet anymore." What emerged over the next several hours was a confession that painted a picture of systematic child abduction, torture, and murder that had been operating for years under the noses of law enforcement. Sanford Clark, who had been brought to California from Canada to live with his uncle when he was just 15, had been both witness and unwilling accomplice to crimes that defied human comprehension. According to Clark's testimony, Gordon Northcott had been abducting children from Los Angeles and surrounding communities since at least 1926, targeting boys between the ages of 8 and 15 who came from poor families unlikely to generate significant police attention. The children were brought to the isolated ranch where they were held in makeshift cells constructed in the chicken coops, hidden from view behind false walls that appeared to be simple farm storage. The abuse these children endured was systematic and brutal. Northcott, aided by his mother Louise and sometimes by other accomplices, would torture the boys for days or weeks before ultimately murdering them. The orange grove behind the ranch house served as a makeshift cemetery where the bodies were buried in shallow graves, hidden beneath the roots of citrus trees that continued to bear fruit season after season. Clark's account revealed the sophisticated nature of the operation. Northcott had contacts in Los Angeles who would identify potential victims. Children from broken homes, runaways, or boys whose disappearances might be easily dismissed by overwhelmed police. The victims were transported to the ranch in the dead of night, often drugged to prevent them from crying out or attempting escape during the journey. Walter Collins, Clark confirmed, had indeed been brought to the ranch in March 1928. The 9-year-old had survived longer than most victims because Northcott had initially planned to use him in a ransom scheme, believing that his mother might pay for his return. But when Christine's persistent inquiries began attracting police attention, Northcott decided that Walter had become too dangerous to keep alive. "He made me help dig the grave," Clark whispered, tears streaming down his face as he described Walter's final moments. The boy kept asking for his mother right until the end. Gordon laughed about it, said the mother would never know what really happened to her precious son. The confession continued for hours as Clark detailed the systematic nature of the crimes. He estimated that at least 20 children had been murdered at the ranch over the past 2 years, with their bodies buried throughout the property. Some victims had been held for weeks, while Northcott tortured them for his own sadistic pleasure. Others had been killed within hours of their arrival, when they proved too difficult to control or when Northcott simply grew bored with them. Louise Northcott, Gordon's mother, was revealed to be not just an accomplice, but often the driving force behind the abductions. She would travel to Los Angeles to scout potential victims, posing as a kindly grandmother who was concerned about children wandering the streets alone. Her maternal appearance made her the perfect lure for boys who had learned to be suspicious of strange men, but still trusted elderly women who offered help or candy. The confession also exposed the network of corruption that had allowed these crimes to continue undetected. Northcott had been paying bribes to certain officials in Los Angeles who would ensure that missing children reports were handled with minimal investigation. The money for these bribes came from selling some of the kidnapped children to other predators rather than murdering them immediately, a human trafficking operation that extended the horror far beyond the Wineville ranch. As Clark's testimony unfolded, Deputy Kuhn realized he was listening to the solution of dozens of unsolved missing children cases from across Southern California. The scope of the crimes was so vast that it would require a coordinated response from multiple law enforcement agencies, including some that might prefer to keep these revelations quiet rather than admit their own failures. But the truth was finally emerging, carried by a young man whose courage in speaking out would vindicate a mother's determination and expose the lies that had protected monsters hiding in plain sight. Within hours of Sanford Clark's confession, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles wound through the dusty roads leading to the Northcott Ranch. Riverside County Sheriff deputies, accompanied by investigators from Los Angeles and federal agents, descended upon the 20-acre property that had hidden unspeakable horrors beneath its agricultural facade. What they discovered would haunt hardened investigators for the rest of their careers. The initial search began at dawn on September 1, 1928. As officers approached the main house, the eerie silence of the property was broken only by the nervous clucking of chickens and the rustle of wind through the orange trees. Gordon Northcott was nowhere to be found. He had fled to Canada the night before Clark's escape, somehow aware that his reign of terror was about to be exposed. Louise Northcott, however, remained on the property, greeting the investigators with a defiant calm that chilled experienced officers. The elderly woman showed no surprise at their arrival, no concern about the accusations against her son. Instead, she watched with cold detachment as investigators began their systematic examination of the property that had served as a killing ground for innocent children. The chicken coops revealed the first evidence of the crimes. Behind what appeared to be ordinary storage areas, investigators found small cells constructed from wooden planks and chicken wire. The cramped spaces, barely large enough for a child to lie down, contained makeshift bedding stained with blood and other evidence of prolonged captivity. Scratched into the wooden walls were desperate messages, names, pleas for help, and crude drawings that spoke to the terror these children had experienced in their final days. Detective Lieutenant Gordon Bowers, leading the investigation, had seen many crime scenes during his 20-year career, but nothing had prepared him for what they uncovered in those hidden chambers. The smell alone was enough to tell us we were looking at something inhuman, he later reported. These weren't holding cells. They were torture chambers designed to break the spirits of children before they were murdered. As the search expanded to the Orange Grove, investigators began the grim task of locating burial sites based on Clark's detailed descriptions. The young man, despite his obvious trauma, proved to be a reliable guide as he led officers to areas where the earth had been disturbed. Using shovels and their bare hands, the investigators began to uncover evidence that would confirm their worst fears. The first grave they opened contained the remains of two young boys, their bodies showing clear signs of torture and violent death. Scraps of clothing helped identify one victim as Louis Winslow, a 12-year-old who had disappeared from Pomona 6 months earlier. His family had been told by police that he was likely a runaway who would return when he got hungry enough. As the excavation continued throughout the day, more graves were discovered scattered throughout the grove. Each site revealed new horrors. Children who had been dismembered, burned, or subjected to other forms of torture before being killed. Some graves contained multiple bodies, suggesting that Northcott had occasionally murdered several victims at once when he grew tired of keeping them alive. Dr. Jeff Wagner, the coroner brought in to examine the remains, struggled to maintain his professional composure as the true scope of the crimes became apparent. In 30 years of forensic work, I had never encountered such systematic cruelty, he later testified. These children had been tortured not just physically but psychologically, kept alive long enough to understand their fate before it was carried out. The investigation revealed sophisticated methods of concealment that suggested the crimes had been planned with careful attention to avoiding detection. Bodies had been buried at different depths and locations to prevent the discovery of one grave from leading to others. Lime had been used to accelerate decomposition and reduce odors that might attract attention from neighbors or animals. Personal effects found at the burial sites told heartbreaking stories of interrupted childhoods. A small leather wallet contained a school photograph and a note from a boy's mother reminding him to be home before dark. A wooden toy soldier, carved by hand, suggested a child who had tried to maintain some connection to normal play even while imprisoned. A pair of eyeglasses, bent and broken, belonged to a studious boy whose family had described him as planning to become a teacher when he grew up. Among the evidence recovered was a blue sailor suit, torn and stained but still recognizable as the outfit Walter Collins had been wearing when he disappeared 6 months earlier. The discovery confirmed what Christine Collins had insisted all along. Her son was dead, murdered by monsters, while the Los Angeles Police Department covered up their incompetence with lies and false hope. The excavation continued for 3 days, ultimately revealing the remains of 23 children whose lives had been cut short by the Northcott's depravity. Each discovery added weight to the growing realization that this case represented one of the worst serial murder sprees in American history, perpetrated against society's most vulnerable members while authorities failed to protect them. As news of the discovery spread, the public reaction was swift and furious, demanding answers about how such crimes could have continued undetected for so long. As investigators continued their grim work at the Northcott Ranch, Sanford Clark found himself in protective custody, struggling to cope with the psychological aftermath of years spent witnessing unspeakable horrors. The young man who had risked everything to expose his uncle's crimes now faced the daunting task of testifying in detail about events that had traumatized him beyond measure. Under the careful guidance of Detective Lieutenant Gordon Bowers and a team of investigators, Clark began providing comprehensive testimony that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. His account revealed not only the systematic nature of the murders, but also the psychological manipulation that had kept him silent for so long. Clark's story began in 1924 when he was just 15 years old and living with his family in Saskatchewan, Canada. Gordon Northcott, his mother's brother, had convinced Clark's parents to allow the boy to come to California for better opportunities. What the family didn't know was that Northcott had specifically targeted his nephew as both an accomplice and a victim for his developing criminal enterprise. From the very beginning, Gordon told me I was complicit in everything he did, Clark testified, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. He said that if I ever told anyone what was happening, I would go to prison too. He convinced me that I was already a murderer just by being there, that no one would believe I was innocent. The psychological control Northcott exercised over his nephew was sophisticated and brutal. Clark was forced to participate in the abductions, told that his involvement made him equally guilty of the crimes. When he showed reluctance or distress, Northcott would beat him severely, then offer comfort while reminding him that they were family who had to protect each other from the outside world. Clark's testimony revealed the methodical process by which victims were selected and abducted. Louise Northcott would scout locations in Los Angeles, identifying children who fit their preferred profile, boys between 8 and 15 from poor families, often those who spent time unsupervised on city streets. She would observe their routines for days or weeks before the actual abduction, learning their habits and identifying the best opportunities to approach them without witnesses. The abduction of Walter Collins had followed this same pattern. Louise had spotted the 9-year-old during one of his regular trips to the Majestic Theater and had observed that he always walked the same route alone. On March 10, 1928, she had approached Walter near the theater, telling him that his mother had been injured and sent her to bring him to the hospital. The boy believed her because she looked like somebody's grandmother, Clark recalled, tears streaming down his face. She was so convincing, so gentle with him at first. Walter got into the car willingly, worried about his mother and trusting this kind old lady who said she was helping him. The journey to the ranch had been traumatic for Walter, who gradually realized that something was wrong when they didn't arrive at any hospital. By the time they reached Wineville, the boy was crying for his mother and trying to escape from the vehicle. Clark described having to help restrain Walter during the final miles of the trip, a memory that clearly tormented him years later. At the ranch, Walter had been imprisoned in one of the hidden cells in the chicken coops, where he joined several other boys who were being held captive. Clark's testimony revealed that Northcott often kept multiple victims alive simultaneously, subjecting them to psychological torture by allowing them to hear the screams and pleas of other children being murdered in nearby cells. Walter kept asking when he could go home to his mother, Clark testified. He talked about her constantly, describing their little apartment and how she worked at the telephone company. Gordon would mock him, telling him that his mother had already forgotten about him and didn't want him back. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical abuse. Northcott would promise the children that they could go home if they cooperated, then break those promises with sadistic pleasure. He forced them to write letters to their families that were never sent, instead reading the messages aloud and laughing at their desperation. Some children were made to watch as other victims were murdered, understanding that they would face the same fate. Clark's account of Walter's final days painted a picture of a brave child who never stopped believing that his mother would find him. Even as Northcott's abuse escalated, Walter maintained his identity and his hope for rescue. He talked constantly about Christine Collins, describing her determination and predicting that she would never stop looking for him. He said his mother was stronger than any of the bad men, Clark recalled. Even at the end, when he was killing him, Walter kept calling for her. He believed she would save him somehow. The testimony revealed that Walter Collins had been murdered on May 8, 1928, exactly 1 week before the LAPD presented Christine with the wrong child and declared her son safely returned. The revelations from Wineville sent shockwaves through California's justice system, exposing a web of corruption, incompetence, and cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. As public outrage mounted over the systematic murder of children and the police department's fraudulent handling of the Collins case, a complex legal battle began that would test the very foundations of American jurisprudence. The first challenge facing prosecutors was the jurisdictional nightmare created by crimes that had occurred across multiple counties and involved suspects who had fled to different countries. Gordon Northcott had escaped to Canada immediately before his nephew's confession, taking refuge with relatives who were sympathetic to his claims of persecution by American authorities. Extradition proceedings began immediately, but the legal process would prove frustratingly slow while evidence continued to mount. Meanwhile, Louise Northcott faced charges in Riverside County for her role in the abductions and murders. The elderly woman's trial became a media sensation, with reporters from across the nation descending on the small courthouse to witness testimony about crimes that defied public comprehension. Louise maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that her son had acted alone and that she had been unaware of the murders taking place on her own property. Her defense strategy relied heavily on contemporary gender stereotypes that portrayed elderly women as incapable of such violence. Mrs. Northcott is a frail grandmother who was manipulated by her disturbed son, her attorney argued. The prosecution asks you to believe that this gentle woman participated in the systematic murder of children, but such evil is simply not in her nature. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Baron Fitz, faced the challenge of proving Louise Northcott's active participation in crimes that many jurors found difficult to believe any woman could commit. Sanford Clark's testimony provided crucial evidence of her role in scouting and abducting victims, but defense attorneys attacked his credibility by highlighting his own involvement in the crimes and his history of mental instability following years of abuse. The trial revealed disturbing details about the family dynamics that had enabled such systematic evil. Louise Northcott had not only participated in the crimes, but had often initiated them, driven by a pathological need to control and destroy innocent life. Witnesses testified that she had shown no remorse when discussing the murdered children, referring to them as problems that needed to be solved, rather than as human beings whose lives had been cut short. Christine Collins, finally released from the psychiatric hospital where she had been wrongfully confined for refusing to accept the imposter child, became a key witness in the prosecution's case. Her testimony about the LAPD's fraudulent investigation and Captain Jones' attempts to silence her exposed a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond the Northcott crimes. They tried to destroy my sanity rather than admit they had made a mistake, Christine testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. While I was locked away for knowing my own son, the real killers were free to continue murdering children because the police were more concerned with protecting their reputation than finding the truth. The revelation that police had known about problems with missing children cases but had consistently failed to investigate them properly sparked calls for a complete overhaul of the Los Angeles Police Department. Captain J.J. Jones found himself the subject of multiple investigations, facing charges ranging from negligence to criminal conspiracy in covering up the department's failures. However, the wheels of justice moved slowly, hampered by political considerations and the desire of powerful interests to minimize the scandal's impact on Los Angeles's reputation. Jones retained influential supporters who argued that he was being scapegoated for systemic problems that predated his tenure. The police commission conducted internal reviews that were widely criticized as whitewashes designed to protect institutional interests rather than deliver accountability. Louise Northcott's trial concluded in December 1928 with her conviction on multiple counts of murder and kidnapping. The jury, presented with overwhelming evidence of her active participation in the crimes, rejected the defense's attempts to portray her as an innocent victim of her son's manipulation. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, making her one of the first women in California history to receive such a harsh sentence for capital crimes. But the most important legal proceeding remained stalled in international courts. Gordon Northcott's extradition from Canada became entangled in diplomatic negotiations and legal technicalities that frustrated prosecutors and victims' families alike. Canadian authorities, while acknowledging the severity of the charges, expressed concerns about sending a Canadian citizen to face potential execution in a foreign country. The delay allowed Northcott to craft an increasingly elaborate defense, claiming that he was innocent of all charges and that Sanford Clark had fabricated the entire story to frame him for crimes committed by others. From his comfortable cell in a Canadian jail, Northcott granted interviews to sympathetic journalists who portrayed him as a victim of American justice system excesses and anti-Canadian prejudice. As 1929 dawned, many of the Wineville victims' families were still waiting for justice, frustrated by legal proceedings that seemed designed more to protect institutions than to deliver accountability for the children who had died. 5 years after Walter Collins disappeared on his way to the movies, Christine Collins stood in a Los Angeles courtroom watching Gordon Northcott finally face justice for his crimes. The man who had tortured and murdered her son, along with dozens of other children, cut a pathetic figure as he was led to the defendant's chair, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and stripped of the arrogance that had once made him believe he was untouchable. The extradition battle had finally ended in 1930 when Canadian authorities, overwhelmed by mounting evidence and international pressure, agreed to send Northcott back to California. His 2 years of freedom in Canada had done nothing to prepare him for the overwhelming case that prosecutors had built during his absence. Sanford Clark's testimony had been corroborated by forensic evidence, additional witness statements, and the discovery of more victims' remains at the ranch. Northcott's trial became the most sensational criminal proceeding in California history, drawing spectators from across the nation who wanted to witness justice being served for crimes that had shocked the public consciousness. Christine Collins attended every day of testimony, sitting in the front row where Northcott could see the face of a mother whose determination had ultimately brought about his downfall. "I wanted him to look at me and remember Walter," Christine later explained to reporters. "I wanted him to see that not all of his victims had been forgotten, that some of us would never stop fighting for the truth." The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Physical evidence from the ranch, including Walter's clothing and personal effects, established clear connections between Northcott and the murders. Sanford Clark, now older and more confident after years of therapy, provided detailed testimony about his uncle's crimes while maintaining his composure under aggressive cross-examination by the defense. Most powerfully, the prosecution presented testimony from Arthur Hutchins Jr., the boy who had been presented to Christine as her returned son. Now 11 years old and living with foster parents, Arthur had recovered enough from his own trauma to testify about how police had coerced him into claiming to be Walter Collins, promising him a home and family if he would cooperate with their deception. "They told me the lady would be happy to have any little boy, and that I should just pretend to remember things about being her son," Arthur testified, his small voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "I was scared and hungry, and they said if I didn't do what they wanted, I would go to jail. Northcott's defense strategy relied on claiming that he had been mentally ill during the period when the crimes were committed, hoping to avoid execution through an insanity plea. His attorneys presented psychiatrists who testified that their clients suffered from various personality disorders that had impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. But the prosecution effectively countered this argument by demonstrating the systematic and calculated nature of the crimes. The elaborate concealment methods, the careful selection of victims, and the sophisticated network of accomplices all pointed to a man who had known exactly what he was doing and had taken deliberate steps to avoid detection. Christine Collins' own testimony proved to be one of the most compelling moments of the trial. Speaking directly about her son and the impact of his loss, she transformed Walter from a statistic into a real child whose life had meaning and whose death demanded justice. Walter was not just another victim, Christine told the jury, her voice strong despite her tears. He was a little boy who helped me with chores, who saved his pennies to buy me flowers, who wanted to grow up to be a policeman so he could help other people. Gordon Northcott didn't just take his life. He stole all the dreams and possibilities that Walter represented. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Northcott was sentenced to death, finally facing the ultimate penalty for crimes that had terrorized a community and shattered dozens of families. As the verdict was read, Christine Collins felt a measure of peace that had eluded her for nearly 6 years. But her fight for justice extended beyond securing Northcott's conviction. Christine had filed civil lawsuits against the Los Angeles Police Department and the city, demanding accountability for the official misconduct that had allowed the murders to continue and had subjected her to illegal imprisonment for refusing to accept lies as truth. The civil litigation exposed the full extent of police corruption and incompetence that had characterized the original investigation. Captain J.J. Jones, faced with overwhelming evidence of his fraudulent handling of the case, was eventually forced to resign in disgrace. Several other officers involved in the cover-up faced disciplinary action, though none received criminal charges. In 1935, Christine Collins was awarded $10,800 in damages, a substantial sum at the time, but money that could never compensate for the loss of her son or the years of anguish caused by official misconduct. More importantly, her case led to significant reforms in police procedures for handling missing children cases and established legal precedents that made it more difficult for authorities to abuse their power in similar situations. Christine Collins never remarried and never had other children. She spent the remainder of her life working as an advocate for other families dealing with missing children, using her experience to help them navigate the legal system and demand proper investigations. She died in 1964, 36 years after Walter's disappearance, having transformed her personal tragedy into a legacy of justice that protected countless other children. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.